a police officer, a fraud case, and a senile pensioner. It's a sad but typically common case. Except what is one to do when the person meant to protect is draining bank accounts and putting the elderly into debt. This documentary aims to present an honest and unfiltered account of the case surrounding the now former Waikato police officer who scammed the elderly. Because of an ongoing legal fiasco, the identity of the central figure in the story remains hidden. At this point in time, due to current suppression orders, the person cannot be legally identified by the media, nor can certain highly specific facts surrounding the case be published. But what we do know paints a picture of a chap who was entrusted with the care of his community's most defenseless citizens. In July of 2025, an unnamed male police officer was stationed in a small Waikato town and was enlisted to serve in the highly respected role of a community liaison officer. As a community liaison officer, his daily duties were fundamentally rooted in crime prevention, and a core part of his job description involved connecting people in need with appropriate support services. Because of this, the officer was frequently assigned to matters involving vulnerable individuals desperately in need of a helping hand. This was not limited to, but heavily included, the elderly. He was supposed to be the friendly face of the force, the officer who checked in on those who couldn't protect themselves. Yet beneath this trusted public persona, the officer was quietly harboring his own hidden issues. And as the age-old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. On July 24, 2025, an elderly woman found herself in the middle of a frightening financial ordeal. For ease of storytelling, we will refer to her as Mrs. E. She was a woman in her 70s who lived entirely alone, and after believing her bank cards had been stolen, visited her local ANZ Bank branch to check for suspicious transaction activity. A staff member at the bank reviewed her accounts and discovered the devastating truth. An unauthorized $4,000 cash withdrawal had been made, and an additional $10,000+ had been drained to purchase Prezi cards at a pack and save supermarket. The realization that she had been robbed of over $14,000 left the elderly pensioner visibly distraught. Reacting to her distress, the bank staff member gave Mrs. E the standard, and usually safest, piece of advice to contact the police immediately. So Mrs. E went and did exactly as she was told. She reached out to the authorities for help, entirely unaware that this simple call for assistance would lead to an even worse financial misfortune. On the 19th of August 2025, the file regarding Mrs. E and her stolen money was allocated to the community liaison officer. Armed with the relevant security camera footage sourced from both an Auckland ATM and the pack and save supermarket, he was tasked with finding the culprits. Recognizing Mrs. E's fragile state, he was advised by a superior to conduct a prevention and reassurance visit. The officer agreed and dropped in to visit the same day. During this initial interaction, he learned that she had her own private CCTV cameras monitoring her property. The two sat down together to review the footage, but they were unable to identify the suspects who had originally stolen her bank cards. Promising to return to review the footage more thoroughly, the officer asked Mrs. E to provide copies of her bank statements, claiming they were necessary to assist in his official inquiry. Over the following days that would proceed, he visited her home on several occasions. During at least one of these visits, he was accompanied by a police colleague, who clearly observed that the elderly woman was easily confused and struggled with her memory. But while the colleague saw Mrs. E as a victim in need of protection, the community liaison officer saw an opportunity, and while reviewing her financial documents, discovered that the pensioner had substantial sums of money resting in her other accounts. It was at this moment that the investigation morphed into a cold, calculated grift. The officer decided to concoct a completely fabricated story. He told Mrs. E that his poor pet doggy was gravely unwell and desperately required expensive surgery. Mrs. E, more than happy to assist the man in the police uniform, agreed to help him out of his fictitious bind. The on-duty uniformed officer then had the elderly woman drive her own vehicle to her local bank branch, where she withdrew $8,000 in cash. He followed closely behind in a marked police patrol car, opting to wait in the car park as she entered the bank. After successfully withdrawing the funds, Mrs. E returned to the car park and gleefully handed over the money, believing that her savings were going towards a good cause. And later that same day, the officer made two separate $4,000 deposits of Mrs. E's money directly into his own personal bank account. The success of this brazen daytime robbery only fueled the officer's greed. On August 27th, he reached out again, asking her to make another cash withdrawal on his behalf. So just like before, Mrs. E would do as she was told. She drove to the same bank branch with the officer's patrol car in tow. But this time, concerned about the randomness and size of the cash withdrawals, vigilant bank staff declined the woman's transaction. Unfazed by this hurdle, the officer simply instructed the confused pensioner to follow him to a completely different bank branch, where the $4,000 withdrawal was successfully processed. Once again, the cash ended up in the officer's personal bank account. Growing wary of the physical withdrawal scheme, he then decided to change tactics to a more covert and digital strategy. Between September 8th and October 17th, the woman would receive 8 more visits from the community liaison officer. During these visits, he managed to secretly use Mrs. E's mobile phone to access her banking app. And over that nearly 6-week period, the officer methodically drained the pensioner's life savings, with transactions ranging anywhere from $4,000 to just under $10,000. To mask the theft and avoid triggering the bank's automated fraud systems, he purposefully gave the transactions harmless-looking references. This included names like wedding gift, early Christmas present, and loan payment. In other cases, he simply and shamelessly used only Mrs. E's name as the reference. The officer's deception finally unraveled on October the 20th, just 3 days after the last fraudulent transaction. Mrs. E, noticing the massive depletion of her funds, arrived at her ANZ bank branch in a highly distressed state. Bank staff immediately reviewed her history and quickly identified the countless large-scale transfers. Reviewing their own internal records, the bank staff soon became deeply distressed themselves, realizing that the very same officer who had previously contacted ANZ about Mrs. E's initial fraud case owned the bank account receiving the stolen funds. They immediately froze Mrs. E's accounts and contacted the police to report their own colleague. Oblivious that the net was closing in, the officer returned to Mrs. E's house twice the very next day. But this time, the elderly woman was too terrified to answer the door, choosing instead to cower and hide inside while the officer lurked around outside the house. The institutional response from the Waikato police was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours of receiving the alert from ANZ, the police had launched a full criminal investigation, officially laid charges, and brought the former officer before the court. In early 2026, he appeared for sentencing in the Hamilton District Court before Judge Stephen Clark. He faced representative charges of accessing a computer system for a dishonest purpose and obtaining by deception. The case was such an unprecedented act that Crown Solicitor Jacinda Hamilton highlighted the sheer audacity of the crime, explicitly describing the scene where the uniformed officer stalked the elderly woman to the bank as extraordinary. The full extent of the theft was also revealed in court. The officer had ultimately drained a staggering $68,000 from the vulnerable pensioner. The Crown Solicitor went on to remark that she fortunately could not find any other case in New Zealand history that she would deem as serious as this one. In an attempt to explain the unexplainable, Defense Counsel Russell Boot leaned heavily into his client's hidden demons. Boot painted a picture of a man whose life had secretly spiraled out of control behind closed doors, revealing to the court that the officer had been battling an online gambling addiction since he was just 18 years old. The defense claimed the disgraced officer was drowning in mounting financial debts, fueled entirely by this long-standing compulsion, and it was this desperate financial ruin that drove him to commit such an out-of-character crime. Leaning on this narrative, Boot urged the judge to hand down a sentence of home detention. He argued for a good character discount, no prior convictions, and that the officer has since taken steps to address the gambling addiction. Boot also highlighted that the man had $30,000 available to immediately pay in reparations, a sum Boot described as significant, given that the man was a father and was no longer employed. But the Crown Solicitor pushed back hard, noting that while the reference to a gambling addiction might offer a convenient context, there was very little actual evidence provided to the court to confirm its severity. She also suggested that of the $30,000 in reparations, $5,000 of those dollars should be given, effective immediately, to Mrs. E. The court also heard the devastating impact the officer's actions had on the elderly pensioner, delivered by her stepdaughter. A victim impact statement from Mrs. E read, "At the time of this, I was already vulnerable. My mind goes over and over what happened, and I find myself asking, why me?" Her statement continued, "The betrayal has shaken my trust, not only in individuals, but in authority and systems I once believed were there to keep individuals safe, to keep me safe." The judge adopted a starting point of 3 years imprisonment for the offending. However, he applied a total of 40% in discounts to the sentence. This included a 25% discount for his guilty plea, 5% for providing the upfront reparation, 5% acknowledging the gambling addiction, and a final 5% for his previous good character. And with that, the unnamed former Waikato police officer was sentenced to 22 months imprisonment. But because New Zealand law allows judges to convert short prison sentences of 2 years or less into home detention, the 22 months was essentially cut in half, allowing the officer to completely avoid a prison cell and walk away with just an 11-month sentence of home detention. Judge Clark said the officer's belated steps to address his gambling addiction, along with his offer of reparation, were what ultimately persuaded the court not to send him to prison. Finally, the man was ordered to repay a full reparation requirement of $68,000. Following the sentencing, the ripple effects of this case struck at the already strained foundation of policing in New Zealand. Waikato Police Superintendent Scott Gemmell spoke to the media, stating, "We are extremely disappointed in the actions of this former officer. It is particularly egregious that this person targeted a vulnerable older person. The public deserves to have trust in us, and police will not hesitate to take action anytime offending like this is detected." Yet, despite these official assurances, the case leaves an uncomfortable stain on the badge. When the very person designated to bridge the gap between vulnerable populations and the state uses that bridge to facilitate a robbery, the collateral damage extends far beyond a single bank account. It fractures the unspoken social contract that ensures a functioning society. The case of Officer Scam serves as a clear reminder, much like the internal breaches of Constable Summer Smith or the high-profile controversies surrounding former Deputy Commissioner Jevon McSkimming, that when authority demands our blind trust, constant vigilance remains our absolute necessity. What are your thoughts on the final sentencing outcome? Does an 11-month term of home detention reflect the severity of the crime? And what can we do to prevent such damning breaches of trust by figures in authority, like the cases mentioned today? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of often overlooked, lesser-known stories. Who else would you like to see us detail next? Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on otherwise unheard narratives.